Philip of Bourbon was born in Versailles in December 1683, a child who entered the world already overshadowed by the ambitions and dynastic politics of his family. From his earliest days, courtiers whispered about the boy's withdrawn manner and fragile disposition. Unlike his boisterous cousins, Philip preferred solitude, staring at candlelight as though he could discover hidden truths in its flickering flame. His eyes were deep and melancholy, often unfocused, as though looking inward rather than at the world before him. At 14, tragedy carved its first deep wound into Philip's mind. His mother, Maria Anna of Bavaria, passed away suddenly. For weeks, the boy would not eat, hardly spoke, and spent his days in near catatonia, locked within himself. Servants tiptoed around his chambers, fearful of the silence that pressed against the walls like a suffocating fog. Physicians tried to coax him back with music, prayer, and remedies, but the shadow of melancholy seemed etched permanently into his soul. Though he eventually rose from bed, a gloom followed him everywhere, a ghost that would never release its grip. His father, the Grand Dauphin, watched with growing concern. Yet in Versailles, weakness was often disguised as eccentricity, and Philip's condition was tolerated more than treated. His destiny, after all, was not to inherit France but to serve as a pawn in the Greater Bourbon plan, the control of Europe. By the time he turned 17, Europe's fate shifted dramatically. The Spanish king, Charles II, died without heirs, leaving a sprawling empire: Spain, Naples, Sicily, the Netherlands, and colonies across the oceans, without a ruler. In his will, Charles named Philip, grandson of Louis XIV, as his successor. The decision stunned the courts of Europe. A sickly, withdrawn youth was to inherit one of the grandest thrones on the continent. Philip himself seemed bewildered. Accounts from that winter describe a young man pale and anxious, trembling when courtiers hailed him as Philip V, King of Spain. He was still more boy than man, ill-prepared for the immense responsibility suddenly placed upon his shoulders. His tutors pressed him to stand tall, to smile, to appear regal, but Philip's nervous glances betrayed his fragility. Even as his carriage rolled southward, carrying him from the glittering halls of Versailles to Madrid's somber Alcazar, he clutched rosary beads tightly in his hands, whispering prayers under his breath. The journey across the Pyrenees was both ceremonial and suffocating. Crowds cheered in every village, seeing in him the promise of renewal, the vigor of Bourbon blood. Yet inside, Philip recoiled. Every shout felt like an accusation, every gaze a demand he could not fulfill. When he finally entered Madrid in 1701, his youthful face was illuminated by torchlight, but behind the glow, his dark eyes revealed only unease. Witnesses claimed he scarcely looked at the people, instead turning constantly toward his advisors as if begging for direction. Madrid was no Versailles. The Spanish court was rigid, steeped in traditions of silence and formality. Philip struggled to adjust. He often retreated from councils, excusing himself with vague complaints of fatigue. In the privacy of his chambers, he paced endlessly, tugged at his hair, or sat staring blankly at crucifixes on the wall. Servants whispered that their new king sometimes wept alone in the night. Yet the machinery of empire required him to stand before ambassadors, generals, and nobles. His young bride, Maria Louisa of Savoy, only 13 at the time of their marriage, became his anchor. He clung to her presence with desperation, unable to bear even brief separations. Still, the pressures mounted. War soon engulfed Europe, the War of the Spanish Succession, as rival claimants fought for Spain's crown. Philip was thrust into a role of figurehead while his ministers maneuvered in his name. Though soldiers fought in his cause, Philip himself was often absent, consumed by inner storms. At councils he sat silent, lips pressed tight, fingers tapping nervously against gilded chairs. When decisions were forced upon him, he gave hesitant nods, like a man drowning and too tired to resist the current. Thus began his reign, a boy king whose fragile mind was chained to the demands of empire. Beneath the crown lay a soul, already fractured, struggling to carry a weight he could neither refuse nor fully comprehend. The first years of Philip's reign were not years of peace, but of fire. From the moment he set foot in Madrid, Europe ignited into the War of the Spanish Succession. France and Spain, bound by blood, stood together against a coalition of Britain, Austria, and the Dutch Republic. The boy king was thrust into the maelstrom of continental politics, his fragile spirit battered by forces far larger than himself. Though Philip bore the title of commander, he was rarely the master of events. Armies clashed in his name, territories shifted, treaties were debated, yet the young monarch often sat silent in councils, his thin hands trembling against the armrests of gilded chairs. Ministers whispered strategies into his ear, urging him to nod at the right moments. Sometimes he did so with a vacant stare. Other times, overcome by nerves, he excused himself abruptly, leaving generals bewildered. The crown upon his head was real, but the power often flowed elsewhere. Spain, already weakened by years of decline, looked to him for strength. Yet what they saw was a youth who could not bear to stand alone. His new queen, Maria Louisa, became more than a wife, she was a lifeline. He clung to her presence with suffocating devotion. Whenever she left his side, even for an hour, he grew restless. He demanded that she sit beside him in councils, even when protocol frowned upon it. When ambassadors questioned why the young queen was present, Philip gave no explanation beyond the pleading look in his eyes. Meanwhile, the war pressed forward. In 1704, the Grand Alliance seized Gibraltar, and Philip was urged to lead his army in person. Reluctantly, he agreed. Accounts describe him riding at the head of his troops, armored and crowned, yet his expression betrayed him, pale, stiff, almost hollow. Soldiers expected fiery speeches, but instead, he mumbled prayers, clutching a crucifix as if warding off unseen terrors. At the Battle of Almansa in 1707, where his French general, the Duke of Berwick, allied Spain to a decisive victory, Philip was present but withdrawn, watching from a hilltop as cannon smoke darkened the skies. To him, the clash of armies sounded less like glory and more like a dirge echoing in his mind. In private, he confessed his terror to Maria Louisa. "I do not command them," he whispered one night, pacing before her. "They command me, these ministers, these generals, these shadows of my grandfather. I am their prisoner in a crown." She soothed him with soft words, but the queen herself was exhausted. She bore his anxieties daily, his dependence consuming her strength. At court, whispers grew. Their young king was weak, unstable, incapable of rule. Yet no one dared speak openly, for Louis XIV's shadow loomed over Spain. The toll on Philip's body and mind was relentless. He refused to change clothes for days, muttered prayers incessantly, and often refused to eat unless Maria Louisa fed him herself. Servants reported that he would suddenly burst into fits of rage, smashing objects, then collapse into sobs. Still, the machinery of war did not halt. The Duke of Marlborough marched through Europe. Victories for the Grand Alliance mounted, and Spain's survival seemed uncertain. Through it all, Philip oscillated between moments of ceremonial bravado and nights of trembling despair. One striking episode occurred when his advisors urged him to abdicate in favor of another Bourbon prince to secure peace. The mere suggestion drove him into a frenzy. Witnesses recalled him gripping his crown, pressing it to his chest as if it were a shield against betrayal. "God gave me this crown," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "Only God may take it." For once, his voice carried conviction. Yet behind it lay not strength, but terror, the terror of losing the one role that defined his fragile identity. As the war dragged on, Philip's image before the people became paradoxical. To some, he was a pious, suffering monarch who bore Spain's trials with Christ-like endurance. To others, he was a broken man, incapable of leadership, propped up by foreign generals and his tireless young queen. Both images were true, woven together in a tragic tapestry. A king both exalted and diminished by his crown that by 1710, after years of bloody struggle, the war turned once more in his favor. Victories in Spain secured his throne, and for a brief moment, Philip seemed steadier. Yet beneath the surface, the fissures in his mind deepened. The constant demands, the ever-present weight of expectation, and his pathological dependence on Maria Louisa eroded him further. The boy who had once stared silently at candle flames in Versailles was now a king who stared just as blankly at a world consumed by fire. And the fire, though briefly dimmed, would soon consume even more not only his kingdom, but his soul. Maria Louisa of Savoy had been only 13 when she married Philip. Barely more than a child herself, she found her life consumed not by the grandeur of court, but by the unrelenting demands of her fragile husband. In time, she became less queen than caretaker, nurse, confidant, and shield against the storms that constantly raged within him. Her days began and ended with Philip's needs. He insisted she sit beside him at councils, walk with him through palaces, and accompany him even in moments of private devotion. He could not sleep unless her presence was near. If she stepped away, he grew restless, calling out her name like a frightened child. What had begun as affection grew into dependency, until the queen herself could scarcely breathe without the weight of her husband's reliance pressing upon her. Spain's courtiers soon noticed. They whispered that decisions were made not by the king, but through the queen's endurance. Diplomats remarked upon how her youthful face, once lively, grew pale and lined before its time. While other queens might have enjoyed music, festivals, and the glitter of courtly intrigue, Maria Louisa lived inside a cage woven of her husband's fears. The strain was relentless. Philip's mood shifted like stormy seas, moments of nervous silence followed by sudden bursts of anger. At night, he often woke in panic, raving about shadows and conspiracies, clinging to her arm as though she alone kept the world from collapsing. She soothed him, whispered prayers with him, sang softly until he calmed. Yet each night stole something from her, the glow of her youth dimming beneath the constant duty. Outside their private chambers, Spain itself struggled. The war dragged on, draining the treasury, filling the streets with widows and orphans. The people longed for a king of fire and resolve, yet what they received was a monarch hidden behind curtains, reliant upon the presence of a girl queen to steady him. In taverns and markets, murmurs grew. Perhaps the crown was cursed, perhaps the king was unfit. But within the Alcazar, Maria Louisa bore the burden alone, her smile concealing exhaustion. In 1714, after more than a decade of this relentless life, her strength finally faltered. She fell ill, her body wasted by fevers. Even on her sickbed, Philip would not leave her side. He demanded she rise, that she speak, that she remain with him, unable to imagine a moment of existence without her. Physicians begged the king to let her rest, but he hovered at her bedside, clutching her hand. His wide, dark eyes filled with terror. On a winter morning, the queen, only 25 years old, breathed her last. The court mourned, but none mourned like Philip. Witnesses reported his cries echoing through the palace, wild and broken. He refused to eat, refused to change clothes, and shut himself away in darkness. He would not bathe, would not cut his hair, and muttered endlessly to himself about death and betrayal. At times he threw himself upon her empty bed, sobbing like a man who had lost not only his wife, but his anchor to reality. Maria Louisa had been more than queen. She had been the fragile wall that held back the floodwaters of Philip's madness. With her gone, the tide began to rise, unstoppable. What followed would plunge Spain deeper into shadows, as the king descended further into instability, and the kingdom was forced to endure the consequences of a monarch crumbling before their eyes. Philip's Early reign began under the watchful eyes of both his grandmother, Maria of Austria, and the formidable court ministers who regarded the boy as a fragile vessel upon which to impose their will. His episodes of melancholy were whispered about behind closed doors, and yet, to the public, he had to appear as the embodiment of Bourbon strength. The courtiers, each vying for influence, transformed the royal palace into a stage where every gesture, every silence, carried the weight of conspiracy. The boy king found himself confined not only within the thick walls of the palace, but also within the invisible cage of expectation. He longed for freedom, moments when he could breathe without a dozen pairs of eyes scrutinizing him. At times he would wander the dim corridors at night, his bare feet tracing the cold marble floors as if searching for shadows to confide in. He spoke to tapestries, to statues, to the portraits of kings long dead, asking them for counsel that never came. The Queen Dowager, Mariana, demanded obedience, weaving her power through the Regency Council. She dismissed Philip's timid protests, treating his frailty as weakness rather than ailment. Ministers whispered that his crown rested on a knife's edge. Others suggested that his melancholy was a sign of divine punishment or madness inherited from his Habsburg blood. The young king absorbed their doubts like poison, which fed the dark clouds in his mind. In public ceremonies, Philip was dressed in regal silks, forced to sit tall on the throne while his body trembled beneath the weight of the robe. He smiled stiffly at courtiers while fighting the urge to sink into silence. Every time a voice rose in the chamber, he flinched as though struck. Yet his eyes, dark and restless, revealed a spark and ember buried beneath the ash of anxiety. Those who looked closely could see it. The fragile boy was also a vessel of something more dangerous, something that could ignite when cornered. Spain's nobility, long fractured by factional disputes, played their game of thrones around the boy king. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, the Count of Oropesa, and other grandees filled the air with honeyed words and veiled threats. Philip was too young to resist them directly, but he learned to listen. Behind his silence grew a sharpness, a patient observation of the masks others wore. In this shadow court, silence was both his prison and his shield. One evening, after a long council session, Philip overheard two courtiers debating whether he should be replaced by a regent from France. Their words stung like blades, yet he held his tongue, pressing his nails into his palms until blood welled. In that pain, he found a strange clarity. Silence was not surrender, it was strategy. He would endure, watching and remembering, until the day his crown was no longer theirs to toy with. The court became a theater of manipulation. Ministers paraded before him with reports of wars, debts, and alliances, expecting little more than his signature. Mariana sought to dictate his every choice, but Philip began to rebel in subtle ways, an unexpected refusal, a pause too long, a piercing gaze that unsettled even seasoned courtiers. These small acts of defiance grew into the seeds of a king's will. Though still cloaked in hesitation and doubt, the boy's melancholy deepened, but within it, something hardened. As whispers of his instability spread, so too did rumors of his intelligence, his ability to absorb every word without betraying a reaction. The courtiers, once dismissive, began to fear that the shadows they wove around him were becoming his allies. He was learning not merely to survive in the labyrinth of courtly deceit, but to master it. And so, in the court of shadows, the fragile boy began his transformation. Behind the trembling hands and haunted eyes lay the birth of a sovereign, who would carry both the brilliance and the curse of his bloodline. Philip's adolescence was not his own. Every morning began with ritual, the attendants dressing him in stiff brocade, the court priest muttering prayers for his weak spirit, and the Regency Council rehearsing him on speeches he barely believed in. To the world, he was a boy king groomed for magnificence. Within, he was a fragile vessel burdened with voices that never ceased. His melancholy deepened in those years. Days blurred into one another, the sunlit courtyards as oppressive as the darkened chambers. He felt himself imprisoned not just by walls, but by expectation itself. Courtiers whispered that he was too frail to rule. Others suggested replacing him with a French prince. Each whisper was like a chain around his ribs. The royal ceremonies drained him. Crowned in gold that weighed like stone, he endured hours on the throne while nobles paraded before him. Their eyes searched not for the king, but for weakness. Philip felt them devour him like vultures circling a wounded stag. He smiled when commanded, spoke when prompted, bowed his head when required, but inside he screamed against the mask. And yet, within the boy, there was a strange resilience. At times he turned his silence into a weapon. He learned to let ministers talk themselves into contradictions, to listen while giving nothing away. His haunted gaze unsettled them more than words could. The young king, dismissed as weak, began to understand the power of observation, the art of letting others believe they controlled him while he quietly mapped their schemes. It was in the solitude of night that his transformation sharpened. Philip would wander the palace's silent galleries, his reflection flickering in windows like a phantom. He whispered prayers to God, not for strength, but for understanding of his suffering. Was he cursed? Was his melancholy a punishment for his bloodline? The silence never answered, but in those long hours, he forged endurance. Still, the tension gnawed at him. His body betrayed his turmoil, sleeplessness, sudden shivers, bursts of trembling that no robe of velvet could conceal. Priests called it a spiritual trial. Physicians prescribed bleeding and tonics. Nothing soothed him. Yet each torment carved him deeper, hollowing a space that ambition would later fill. The Regency Council began testing his will with minor decisions, expecting him to fail. Instead, Philip surprised them. When asked to approve a tax levy, he paused, studied their faces, and refused, not with thunder, but with quiet finality. The chamber fell silent. It was the first moment when the boy king's shadow stretched beyond his frailty. Behind the melancholy, a steel thread was forming. He realized that the crown was not simply a burden, it was a weapon, if only he could wield it. To master Spain, he first had to master himself. The court still mocked him in whispers, but they also began to fear him. For though his hands trembled, his eyes did not. And in those eyes, haunted yet unyielding, the promise of a sovereign flickered like a flame struggling against the wind. The whispers in the palace had grown louder. Every corridor echoed with murmurs that carried Philip's name, shadowed with doubt and malice. Courtiers who once bowed politely now leaned in to discuss his weaknesses, conspiracies forming in hushed voices. Philip felt the air itself thick with schemes, a stifling web spun by those who envied his position. He had learned to listen. Every smile, every polite bow, every hesitant footstep became a message. In the late hours, he traced these patterns, noting the servants who lingered too long, the advisors who avoided his gaze, the nobles whose laughter held a strange edge. The boy king understood that survival meant seeing without being seen, speaking without speaking, striking without striking. One evening, a messenger arrived with a sealed letter, the wax still warm. It bore threats veiled in courtesy, a warning that some faction sought to replace him with a foreign prince. Philip read it silently, his sharp eyes narrowing. His fingers trembled not from fear, but anticipation. The game was escalating, and he would not be unprepared. Philip summoned a private audience with his most trusted aide, an old tutor who had remained loyal against the tides of intrigue. Together, they mapped the conspirators, noting connections to foreign courts, secret alliances, and rumored bribes. Every line drawn in ink on parchment was a lifeline. For the first time, Philip felt the exhilarating clarity of power not inherited, but earned through cunning. The nights became his laboratories. By candlelight, he practiced speeches, crafted subtle gestures, tested his own expressions. Each movement was calculated to convey confidence and innocence simultaneously. to hide fear behind decorum. He was no longer just a boy. He was a mirror, reflecting exactly what the court wanted to see, while holding his true intentions invisible. But the tension exacted a toll. Sleep eluded him, his stomach churned with anxiety, and his hands shook more frequently. Courtiers began to notice his pallor, whispering that the crown had broken him. Philip welcomed the misconception. The more they believed him fragile, the less they anticipated his growing acuity. Then, one fateful morning, an open confrontation arose. A prominent duke accused him of neglecting his duties, citing minor errors in ledger entries and ceremonial arrangements. Philip listened, expression unchanging, letting the words strike and pass. When his turn came, he spoke not with anger, but with a calm that froze the chamber. Each rebuttal was precise, revealing subtle contradictions in the duke's statements. By the time he finished, the chamber murmured, not with derision, but with awe. Philip realized then that fear and respect were two sides of the same coin. Those who had plotted against him now reconsidered, some retreating, others testing patience cautiously. The palace remained a dangerous place, but Philip felt a strange exhilaration. He was learning to weave shadows, to dance within the web of power while remaining unseen. And in those rare, solitary moments when the candle flickered and the corridors were silent, he allowed himself a small smile. The boy king, once trembling and haunted, was becoming something else entirely. A sovereign shaped by adversity, a mind sharpened by conspiracy, a heart armored in shadow. The tension within the palace reached its peak. Philip now moved like a shadow, unseen yet fully aware, tracking the subtle gestures of those around him. Rumors of rebellion swirled among the nobles, some emboldened by whispers from neighboring courts, others driven by ambition or fear. The boy king realized that the crown, once a symbol of authority, had become a knife suspended over his neck. In the quiet of dawn, Philip walked the battlements, surveying the city below. Smoke from chimneys rose in delicate spirals, merchants prepared their stalls, and guards patrolled in precise formation. Everything appeared normal, orderly, but Philip knew the calm was fragile. A single spark could ignite chaos, and he would be the first target. The council meeting was a calculated storm. Philip listened as voices clashed, accusations thrown like daggers. Each noble sought to sway opinion, to undermine the others, to place themselves closer to the throne. Philip's hand rested lightly on the table, not trembling, but taut with tension. When he spoke, his words were measured, cutting through the din with precision. He exposed false alliances, highlighted contradictions, and suggested compromises that only a keen mind could devise. The room fell silent, a momentary truce forged in awe of his intellect. Yet the shadows outside the palace walls were not so easily tamed. Spies reported gatherings in hidden courtyards, secret meetings in taverns, whispers of armed men ready to strike at night. Philip realized he needed more than intellect. He needed loyalty, action, and subtle intimidation. He selected a group of young knights, loyal not to rank or favor, but to him personally. Through secret training and whispered instructions, he forged a network of guardians ready to act before conspiracies could materialize. At night, Philip's dreams were restless. He envisioned the palace overrun, corridors echoing with the clash of steel, shadows consuming light, the weight of failure pressing upon his chest. Yet each morning, he rose with renewed resolve, honing strategies, memorizing faces, analyzing intentions. His loneliness was profound, yet it sharpened him, honing his senses to detect deception and courage alike. One fateful evening, a secret messenger arrived with news of an imminent uprising. Philip's pulse quickened, yet his face remained serene. Plans were laid in hushed tones, contingencies prepared for every scenario. As moonlight spilled across the polished floors of the council chamber, Philip understood that this night would test everything he had learned: strategy, patience, courage. and the delicate art of appearing vulnerable while being unbreakable. When the conspirators struck, they found an empty palace in appearance, but every hallway, every chamber, every guard positioned with intent. The rebellion faltered before it began, foiled by foresight and calculated restraint. Philip moved among the captives with cold precision, his long dark hair framing a face that was pale but unyielding, eyes sharp with the knowledge that he had not only survived, but mastered the art of ruling amidst shadows. As dawn broke over the city, the boy king felt an unfamiliar surge of triumph. The palace was secure, his power solidified, and the conspirators humbled. Yet Philip knew the game was far from over. The court remained a chessboard, and he was both king and player, moving pieces with patience, cunning, and unshakable resolve. The city lay beneath a calm morning sky, a deceptive serenity masking the turbulence still roiling in Philip's mind. He had survived countless plots, endured betrayals, and outwitted both noble and enemy alike. Yet the final reckoning, the culmination of years of patience and vigilance, was approaching. The palace hummed with quiet tension. Courtiers whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward Philip, measuring his reaction, speculating his next move. Philip, long dark hair falling over a composed, pale face, moved through the halls with deliberate grace, greeting nobles with a courteous bow, though every step was calculated, every word a subtle assertion of control. He was aware that the eyes of the entire realm were upon him. Any misstep would be seized and exploited. At the center of the palace, the council chamber had been transformed. Long tables were arranged in ceremonial precision, torches casting dramatic shadows across the stone walls, a subtle reminder of power and legacy. Philip took his seat at the head, the boy king now fully embodying the weight of the crown. He reviewed the reports of loyalists and spies, tracing the movements of every faction, every subtle alliance, the web of politics stretching taut under his scrutiny. As the council convened, a sense of inevitability filled the room. One by one, nobles presented their grievances, their demands, their subtle threats cloaked in formal speech. Philip listened with quiet patience, analyzing not just the words but the hesitation, the tone, the flicker of emotion in their eyes. When it was his turn to speak, his voice carried both authority and precision. He exposed plots, revealed hidden motives, and offered resolutions that demonstrated his mastery of strategy and insight into human nature. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, distant drums echoed through the city. Messages had come. A rival lord sought to exploit the perceived fragility of the boy king, mustering mercenaries to challenge his authority. Philip did not flinch. He had anticipated this confrontation, arranging the city's defenses, positioning loyal troops strategically, and preparing for the decisive encounter. Night fell with a chilling silence. Torches flared along the palace walls, casting elongated shadows over the courtyards and corridors. Philip, mounted on a dark steed, rode among his trusted guards, inspecting the fortifications and ensuring every contingency was in place. His expression was resolute, eyes scanning the horizon, every muscle coiled for action, yet his demeanor remained controlled, exuding confidence rather than fear. As dawn broke, Philip stood atop the highest balcony, overlooking the city that had survived turmoil. His long hair caught the light, his pale features calm, yet defined with the weight of responsibility and triumph. The palace was secure, his allies loyal, and the rebels either captured or scattered. He understood that rulership was not simply the wielding of power, but the subtle command over perception, the foresight to anticipate, and the patience to act. Philip's journey had been forged in shadow and pressure, shaped by betrayal and conflict, yet now the final reckoning had solidified his place. He was no longer merely a boy king. He was a strategist, a ruler, a master of both the art of politics and the discipline of patience. The future remained uncertain, as it always would, but Philip had proven that intellect, resolve, and calculated courage could steer even the most turbulent currents toward triumph.